I see them crowd on crowd, they walk the earth, dry, leafless trees, no autumn wind laid bare, and in their nakedness find cause for mirth, and all unclad would winter's rudeness dare. No sap doth through their clattering branches flow, whence springing leaves and blossoms bright appear. Their hearts the living God has ceased to know, who gives the springtime to the expectant year. They mimic life, as if from him to steal his glow of health, to paint the livid cheek. They borrow words for thoughts they cannot feel, that with a seeming heart their tongue may speak, and in their show of life more dead they live than those that to the earth with many tears they give. What you just heard was a poem titled The Dead by a man named Jones Very. He was relatively prominent in the mid-1800s, and even the likes of Ralph Waldo Emerson considered him gifted. And yet, despite this, you will rarely hear of him anymore. No one even bothers to mention him. At best, he will have a couple of poems hidden inside a few collections of American poetry. Finding a book dedicated to him is near impossible out in the wild without the likes of online sources like Amazon. His story is one worth being familiar with, however. As a boy, he kept his nose buried in his books. His mother, Lydia, was an atheist, a rarity for the day, and she pompously shouted this fact about herself from the rooftops. The attention this drew, in turn, caused others to introduce her son to theology, an act of rebellion I am sure they were proud of. He was hooked immediately, and, in a way, it proved his undoing years later. Perhaps it was his personality that found it so attractive. Very graduated from Harvard and held several lectures. His poetry was published to some small degree with a positive reception. Emerson introduced him to the likes of mysticism, and he eventually became a follower of transcendentalism, the philosophical movement of the time that declared humankind as inherently good and society as corrupt. This latter development contributed to his aforementioned undoing. Very was, presumably, bipolar and had a breakdown, along with several religious experiences. As he described it, I felt within me a new will. It was not a feeling of my own, but a sensible will that was not my own. These two consciousnesses, as I may call them, continued with me. He spiraled at length, and even those who previously admired him became estranged due to his extreme behavior. He claimed that the second coming of Christ was occurring within him, and he condemned those who disagreed. He was convinced his poetry at the time was divinely inspired, and it is somewhat evident in many of his poems. He often damned those around him and the society they lived in, and yet his verse lacked much of self-awareness or personal insight. It is up to interpretation, of course, but however lovely his poetry, it is heavily implied that his main goal was spreading his own brand of theology. All in all, he believed himself more important and divine than those around him, much to everyone's distaste, of course. Suddenly, this gifted young man, an oddity his peers observed from afar, became a heretic to be gossiped about behind his back. He was committed to an asylum for a month, where he taught his fellow patients the wonders of Shakespeare. Oddly enough, Jones always knew this divine hand upon his life would be temporary. A year after his breakdown, he declared the spirit had left him. Emerson had an eccentric and optimistic take, all of his own, on this prophetic phase his friend had undergone. I knew a man who, under a certain religious frenzy, cast off his drapery and spoke to the conscience of every person he encountered, and that with great insight and beauty. At first, all men agreed he was mad, but persisting, he attained to the advantage of bringing every man of his acquaintance into true relations with him. To stand in true relations with men in a false age is worth a fit of insanity, is it not? In closing, Jones Very was a man who could be viewed from various angles. In one way, he was a gifted poet and intelligent individual. In another, he was a self-righteous madman who clung white-knuckled to his illogical convictions. He was a contradiction, in a sense, and is to be admired for what he was, clearly flawed, but certainly worth investigating and a place in history. I will close with a final poem of his, one that glows with his best attributes and ideas: serenity in the world and peace with the Creator. The bubbling brook doth leap when I come by, because my feet find measure with its call. The birds know when the friend they love is nigh, for I am known to them both great and small. The flower that on the lonely hillside grows expects me there when spring its bloom has given, and many a tree and bush my wanderings knows, and e'en the clouds and silent stars of heaven. For he who with his Maker walks aright shall be their Lord as Adam was before. His ear shall catch each sound with new delight, each object wear the dress that then it wore, and he, as when erect in soul he stood, hear from his Father's lips that all is good.